Be here, and on behalf of Michael, may I wish you all a good Canada Day. And I'd like also to thank all the organizers. I know how much work it takes to put together an event like this, and is this coming through? I know how much work it takes to put together an event like this, and I appreciate all the work that you've done to make this possible. It is an honor for me to participate in this tribute to Michael Meir, particularly in the city of Jerusalem, because of our common history here 35 years ago. In 1984-85, the Institute for Advanced Studies of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem hosted one of its annual seminars on the topic of the history of the Holocaust. The senior Israeli scholars who had organized the seminar were Yehuda Bauer, Israel Gutman, Shaul Friedlander, Dov Polka, and Shmuel Lamal. The junior Israeli scholars invited to participate were Dina Porat and Richard Cohen. Two short-term visitors to Jerusalem, George Mossa and Raoul Hilberg, briefly joined the seminar. Three other scholars were invited to join the seminar from overseas: Bernard Wasserstein, Michael Meir, and myself. It was, needless to say, one of the most important and rewarding years of my scholarly career, and also the starting point of a lifelong and cherished friendship with Michael. One outcome of that seminar was the publication of Michael Meir's The History of the Holocaust in History in 1987, as well as his 9-volume, 15-part anthology of scholarly articles, The Nazi Holocaust, 2 years later. Together, they reflect much of what we discussed that seminar year. They also constitute the first comprehensive attempt to take historiographical stock of what was then the relatively new field of Holocaust studies. The Holocaust in History went to press just 25 years after the pivotal year of 1961, which was marked by both the Eichmann trial here in Jerusalem and the publication of Raoul Hilberg's The Destruction of European Jews in the United States. It appeared just 2 years before the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe and the ensuing access to a new trove of archival documentation that has proven so important to our field. In rereading the book for this occasion, my thoughts sorted themselves along 3 lines. First, I was impressed by how well our then still young field had treated a number of major topics. Key works in this regard have aged well and remain foundational. Second, there were topics that were just emerging, which Michael perceptively recognized as opening important new avenues of research. And finally, of course, there were areas of study that were not yet recognized at that time, but have taken on major importance since. I would like briefly to explore each of these categories. 2 early foci of Holocaust studies, not unnaturally, were anti-Semitism and Hitler. Eschewing the 2 millennia long history of anti-Semitism approach, because the contours of anti-Semitism were constantly shifting, Michael moved directly to Germany in the late 19th century. Relying on the foundational works of Peter Pulzer, Shulamit Volkov, and Richard Levy, he judged German anti-Semitism of that period a, quote, low-grade consensus. A more radical strand of German anti-Semitism, what Uriel Toll called anti-Christian anti-Semitism, and Shaul Friedlander would later dub redemptionist anti-Semitism, did not become predominant until after World War I. Hitler, the ideologue, became his prime proponent and driving force. In accepting the formulation of William Sheridan Allen, Michael argued that most Germans were drawn to anti-Semitism because they were drawn to Hitler and the Nazis, not vice versa. Anti-Semitism was absolutely central to the Third Reich because Hitler determined that it should be so. And thus, Michael endorsed the formula, no Hitler, no Holocaust. However, if the Holocaust was inexplicable without Hitler, it was also not explained solely by Hitler. Looking back, some commentators have been quite dismissive of the so-called intentionalist-functionalist controversy as an artificially polarized, arcane debate, splitting hairs over the details of the decision-making process behind the final solution and Hitler's role therein. Michael's book provides extensive coverage of this controversy and reminds us how vibrant and important it was to the coming of age of Holocaust studies in the 1980s. As Ian Kershaw reminds us, as late as 1979, in the famous Cumberland Lodge Conference, where Tim Mason introduced the terms intentionalism and functionalism to designate the contending interpretational approaches among historians of German history, the topic of the Holocaust was not discussed. Quite simply, the Nazi persecution of the Jews and the final solution were not seen as central to understanding Hitler and National Socialism, much as World War II and 20th century Europe. The pioneering works of Karl Schleunus and Uwe Adam from the early 1970s may have been electrifying to young scholars of my generation just beginning to undertake Holocaust research, but not to the doyens of German history. At two subsequent conferences in Paris, 1982, and Stuttgart, 1984, however, raised by Philip Friedman's notion of messianic complex, were not typical. In fact, given the diversity of Jewish response and change in the composition of Jewish councils over time, there was no such thing as a typical Jewish council. Second, from 1939 to 41, the greatest threat to Jewish ghettos were German administrators pursuing a lethal policy of deliberate attrition. Thus, ghetto leaders who successfully cultivated local German authorities to mobilize Jewish labor for production improved ghetto conditions and warded off the fate that later befell millions of incarcerated Soviet POWs. Finally, with a fatal turn in German policy to systematic and total mass murder, the response of Jewish leaders was not determined by Arendt's moral collapse or Hilbert's historical conditioning, but by the burden of collective responsibility, the lack of sufficient knowledge, the exhausting and all-consuming ordeal of the daily struggle against myriad afflictions, and the total asymmetry of their own powerlessness vis-a-vis German power. Michael concluded that a historical understanding of the dilemmas faced by the Jewish Council deepened, the sharp edge of accusation was wearing off. Assessment of Jewish resistance during the Holocaust was, as Michael notes, an emotionally laden topic which it was difficult to pursue with historical detachment, given post-war concerns about projecting a Jewish image of heroism. Certainly, Hilbert's claim that Jewish resistance was both minimal, reflecting a long diasporic tradition on the one hand, and ineffective, damaging the Nazis in no significant way on the other, was perceived by many as a cruel provocation rubbing salt in a wounded Jewish psyche. Beyond the emotional barrier, however, Meir noted many problems facing any serious historical assessment of Jewish resistance. One was definition. Did one employ a narrow concept limited to armed resistance, as Hilbert did, or a broad concept, such as Yehuda Bauer's, any organized activity intended to thwart German intentions and policies? Was resistance measured by results or intentions? Did it include Jews fighting with the French Maquis or the Yugoslav partisans, opposing the Nazis, but without any specific or separate Jewish identity or goal? In the end, Michael argued for a subjective acceptance of the Jews' own understanding of their actions. This notion could include Weiss Mendel's bribery of German officials in Slovakia, the Onek Shabbat's collecting of documents in Warsaw, or even a theater production in the Vilna Ghetto. Michael also argued for the need to get beyond the notion that Jewish resistance was the natural and obvious response, and therefore it was the absence of Jewish resistance that had to be explained as some kind of anomaly. Jewish resistance in Europe was the act of a very small minority. Resistance everywhere in Europe was the act of a very small minority. Moreover, Jewish resistance faced special obstacles that others did not. No other population faced as pervasive and draconic a threat of total collective reprisal as Jews, so most Jews initially saw resistance as a reckless, asocial act endangering the entire community. Among other populations, as hope for victory increased, so did resistance. For Jews facing annihilation long before victory was in sight, resistance made sense only when all hope was abandoned. For Jews, resistance was the war of the doomed, not participation in a rising tide of anticipated victory. It often had been undertaken in the most uncongenial environment of ghetto or camp, and without outside support or aid. Moreover, Michael surmised it might even have had the perverse effect of accelerating Nazi liquidation measures, a judgment later affirmed by Charles Friedlander. Thus, concerning both Jewish councils and Jewish resistance, Michael was correct in predicting that as we learned more, the false dichotomy of acquiescence versus resistance would fade. Michael has most critically challenged a prevailing ethos of accusatory history and argued for understanding over condemnation in the chapter he entitled Bystanders, for which primarily dealt with the international response to the Holocaust. Here, the two lightning-rod figures that had most severely attracted condemnation from the 1960s to the 1980s were Franklin Roosevelt and Pius XII. Concerning the failure of international rescue, Michael noted the historian's challenge in writing about what did not happen. That is, Jewish refugees were not accepted. The American Jewish community was not united. Chances for aiding Jewish escape from the Nazi grasp were not explored. Auschwitz-Birkenau was not bombed. Above all, standard procedures and priorities were not altered, and available information was not processed into knowledge. Michael cautioned against the temptation of historians' hubris, condemning people then for not acting with the same wisdom and moral awareness that we have obtained through hindsight. And he warned against the, quote, tricks that the historical record plays on those who do not sufficiently guard against that temptation. People believe what they were prepared to believe, and nothing prepared them to believe the unprecedented and incomprehensible. Thus, despite the availability of information, what Bernard Wasserstein dubbed the official mind continued to filter such information through a pre-war framework. For many, Jews remained potential refugees who constituted a problem to be avoided, not victims facing total annihilation who needed to be saved. Ultimately, Hitler's ability and commitment to kill Jews under his control far exceeded any Allied ability and commitment to save them. If David Wyman judged FDR's response to the Holocaust the, quote, greatest failure of his presidency, the silence of Pius XII received even more excoriating treatment at the hands of Walter Holkouth. While the historiographical wars over Pius XII have been unremitting since the publication of the Holocaust in history, with the accusers like John Cornwell and Daniel Goldhagen vying with the explainers like Michael Phayer and Jacques Kornberg, what is impressive is how closely Michael's brief treatment anticipated and encapsulated the findings of the latter, that is, the explainers. The Catholic Church in general, and the Vatican in particular, had a tradition of sympathy for right-wing authoritarian regimes, as opposed not only to communist, but also to liberal and social democratic regimes. It had, of course, its own tradition of Christian or religious as opposed to racial anti-Semitism. And it had a tradition of neutrality and non-intervention in both the wars between and the internal secular affairs of non-communist European nations. Pius XII exemplified all of these traditions, and especially the tradition of diplomatic neutrality, beyond negotiating concordats to protect church interests, given his background in Vatican diplomacy. And of course, he did not break with the Catholic theology that gave priority to keeping the institutional church intact in order to continue saving souls, rather than risk it to save lives. More particular to the immediate circumstances of World War II, he was fearful for the physical safety of the Vatican in first fascist and then Nazi-occupied Italy, as well as of communist expansion into Europe. Thus, he eschewed any open condemnation of the Nazi final solution, not just to preserve Vatican neutrality. After all, he rejected Polish pleas to condemn Nazi atrocities against Catholics in Poland and German pleas to condemn Allied bombings of German cities, but also to avoid any action that might undermine the German warfare effort against the Soviet Union. Ultimately, his neutrality even extended to activities within the church. He did not curb the efforts of men like Burzio, Rada, and Roncalli to help Jews, just as he did not curb the efforts of Orsenigo in Berlin during the war and Hudel after to help Nazis. If one is looking for a very brief treatment that dissects the complicated controversy surrounding Pius XII, one could do far worse than turn to this section of the Holocaust in history, despite the number of important books that have appeared since. Sadly, if there is a major lacuna in the book, it is that Meir did not extend his treatment to the already extensive historical literature concerning the Catholic and Protestant churches in Germany. In addition to the existing historiography concerning these major controversies, Michael also perceptively identified important topics on which scholarship was just emerging. One such topic was the study of public opinion in Germany. Historians who explored the question in the pre-1989 period emphasized the difference between hardcore Nazis, for whom the Jewish question was a priority, and ordinary Germans who accepted the regime's legal discrimination and persecution, but were averse to the crass public violence and wanton destruction of property. Ultimately, widespread indifference to the fate of the Jews allowed the regime to pursue its own anti-Semitic priorities without penalty. Ian Kershaw summed up this position in the memorable phrase that, quote, "The road to Auschwitz was built by hatred, but paved with indifference." The Israeli historian Dov Kolka generally accepted this description of, quote, "strikingly abysmal indifference" and, quote, "general passivity" on the part of the German population, but found the term indifference itself too morally neutral, and proposed instead the more judgmental term of passive complicity. In the post-1989 period, historians placed a greater emphasis on an anti-Jewish consensus, an acceptance of the Jew as the enemy that allowed for radicalization of persecution in the war years. Robert Galately argued that enforcement of Jewish policy was possible because active citizen participation through denunciation, and that for most Germans the regime depended less on coercion than consent. Peter Fritzsche explored the degree to which Germans internalized National Socialism and engaged in what he called racial grooming, while Claudia Kunz explained how the regime instilled an ethnic conscience as an essential backdrop for its genocidal policies. In short, the Nazi regime enjoyed considerable success in infusing German society with a racialized perspective through which to view and understand their world. In the end, awareness of the final solution was an open secret, especially in terms of mass shootings in the East and the general, if not specific, fate of the deportees. Combined with increasing probability of defeat, this led to growing fear of retribution, a sense of guilt or bad conscience, a distancing from the regime, and repression of what they had known and done. According to David Van-Leer, Germans, quote, knew enough to know that it was better not to know more, and were, quote, caught between feelings of guilt and an urge to deny responsibility. As Peter Longbrecht noted, Germans embraced repression, denial, and Flucht in der Unwissenheit, flight into ignorance. A second area in which Michael perceptibly identified emerging topics concerned the broader context and background of the final solution, namely the T4 program on the one hand and Nazi population policy on the other. The T4 program, he noted, provided not only, quote, the development of killing methods and training of personnel that would be transferred to the death camps of Operation Reinhardt, but also, quote, the propensity to murder as a problem-solving solution. Subsequently, of course, Henry Friedlander's The Origins of Nazi Genocide, as well as many other studies, have illuminated in detail not just these direct connections between T4 and the final solution, but also how more broadly eugenics and what the Germans dubbed racial hygiene was one of the key ideological tributaries of Nazi racial policy. Michael also noted that, quote, Nazi Jewish policy was part of a vast German project for demographic reordering of Eastern Europe, and that, quote, the destruction of European Jewry should not be studied in isolation from other aspects of Nazi population policy. This insight has been confirmed by many subsequent studies. In the fall of 1939, the Nazis developed a near-total de- and repopulation scheme for the incorporated territories of Western Poland, which envisaged the ethnic cleansing of 8 million Poles and Jews and the replacement with ethnic Germans from areas of Eastern Europe ceded to Stalin and the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact. Expulsion of Jews first to the Lublin reservation, then to Madagascar, was simply one part of this larger scheme. The man who emerged as the coordinator of these mass expulsions was, of course, Heydrich's rising star, Adolf Eichmann. Plans for Barbarossa, recent scholarship has shown, included a vast hunger plan that was to result, as one German document stated, in the deaths of umpteen million people. And the general plan for the East, the Generalplan Ost, in its constantly radicalizing iterations, ultimately foresaw the removal from the German Lebensraum through execution, starvation, and expulsion over the Urals of some 30 million Slavs. In a brief selection on functionaries of the final solution, Michael wrote, quote, "For the historians of the Holocaust, the greatest challenge has not been in making sense of Hitler, but rather understanding why so many followed him down his murderous path." He followed this with an examination of bureaucratic perpetrators, primarily as portrayed by Ralph Hilbert, a faceless cross-section of German society which operated, quote, "on its own track of self-assertion, and whose actions were shaped more by," and this is quoting Hilbert, "a matter of spirit, of shared comprehension, of consonance and synchronization, than by laws and commands." As an example of a case study that puts faces on some of these bureaucrats, he cited my own study of the Jewish experts of the German Foreign Office and his conclusion that when zealous bureaucrats were trying to anticipate the will of the Fuhrer, initiative from below obviated the necessity of orders from above. Since then, of course, the scholarship on Holocaust perpetrators has exploded. One manifestation of this was the controversy over the face-to-face killers. In 1992, I published a case study of Reserve Police Battalion 101 and the role of its ordinary men in lethal ghetto clearing and mass killing of Polish Jews, as well as the relentless Jew hunt for hidden survivors. I emphasized a multi-causal explanation of motivation, with emphasis on social psychological factors that influence the dynamics of group behavior, such as conformity, peer pressure, and role adaptation, as well as the division of the battalion into three factions: eager killers, compliers, and evaders. 4 years later, Daniel Goldhagen's Hitler's Willing Executioners argued that a culturally embedded eliminationist anti-Semitism, particular to Germany, drove ordinary Germans uniformly to kill, not only with a belief in the justice and necessity of their actions, but also with gusto and extreme personal cruelty. The controversy was important to Holocaust studies in general in shifting the focus away from abstract debates over ideology and structure and to the actual human actors and their motivations and behavior. The controversy also stimulated fruitful scholarship in various ways, and especially to transcend the false dichotomy of sharply opposed cultural anthropological versus situational social psychological explanations. As Leonard Newman pointed out, situations are culturally constructed and interpreted, so that the cultural and situational factors are inseparable. Harald Belzer and Thomas Kuhne anchored the particular perceptions and behavior of ordinary German police and soldiers in the contingent context of 20th century German history and society, and emphasized the transformation of moral norms under the Nazis that made it possible for them to kill Jews and other non-combatants without a sense of guilt or criminality. Kuhne in particular noted the powerful resonance of two concepts, Kameradschaft and Volksgemeinschaft, comradeship and racial community, that enabled the Nazi regime to harness Germans to its murderous ideological mission. A second strand of perpetrator studies in the 1990s concerned the ideological true believer. Ulrich Herbert's exemplary study of Werner Best and Michael Bildt's collective biography of the Reichssicherheitsamt leadership highlighted the role played by a particular cohort of ideologically committed young Nazis. Born shortly before the outbreak of World War I, educated in German universities in the early 1920s, they embraced an ultra-nationalist, anti-democratic, racist, and folkish Weltanschauung, and an allegedly sober and scientific, rather than emotional, anti-Semitism. They became the intellectual cadres of the Nazi police state and exercised a fateful influence far beyond their numbers in society. No figure of the Nazi middle-level elite attracted as much attention as Adolf Eichmann. In unanimous rejection of the Eichmann defense strategy in Jerusalem that depicted him as the bureaucratic non-entity unmoved by anti-Semitism or ideology, the post-1989 studies portrayed him as a man who had internalized Nazi anti-Semitism, as well as an ambitious careerist working towards the Fuhrer, to use Ian Kershaw's phrase, though in varying degrees, these historians also strove to see him as the product of his time and place. And finally, the ordinary soldiers of the Wehrmacht became a focal point of perpetrator studies in the 1990s. Much earlier, of course, Hilbert had named the German military as one of the four major components of the machinery of destruction. and many scholars had noted its role in preparing and implementing the war of destruction against the Soviet Union and the mass death of Soviet POWs, and in either aiding or implementing on its own many shooting actions against Jews. And Omar Bartov pioneered early studies in the barbarized and Nazified ethos of the soldiers of what he termed Hitler's army. In the late 1990s, the traveling Wehrmacht exhibition graphically documented through photos and letters the criminal involvement of even ordinary German soldiers that scholars both in Germany and abroad had long accepted, but not the German public, which by and large had clung to the legend of the clean Wehrmacht. The mislabeling of some photographs required the exhibit organizers to redesign the exhibit in a less graphic manner, but continuing scholarship overwhelmingly affirms the verdict of Wehrmacht complicity, both on the institutional and individual level. Scholarly debate on Nazi decision-making for the final solution moved forward in the 1990s as well. In comparison to the historiographical polarization of the previous decades, a surprising degree of consensus emerged. First, most historians agreed that there was no Big Bang theory for the origins of the final solution, predicated on a single decision made at a single moment. Rather, there had been an incremental decision-making process. Second, 1941 and early 1942 were seen as the decisive period, but there was also a shift towards emphasizing continuity over discontinuity between the final solution and the earlier atrocities of the Polish campaign, the policies of ethnic cleansing and population resettlement, and the methodical murder of the T4 program. Third, most scholars who accepted the two-decision thesis for the final solution, that is one for the fate of Soviet Jews and one for the rest of European Jews, now moved those two decisions back several months. That is, the transition to systematic genocide on newly conquered Soviet territory did not occur until the summer of 1941, and that a second decision-making process sealing the fate of European Jews west of the Molotov-Ribbentrop line reached closure sometime in the latter half of 1941 or even later. Fourth, there was general acceptance of a consensus model, as anticipated by Hilbert's second edition, which superseded the previous functionalist emphasis on rivalries and competition within the Nazi system. In this model, the center and periphery interacted to mutually radicalize one another, and cooperation among a full panoply of participants was more important than their rivalries and conflicts. Differences, of course, also remained. When was the tipping point for the second decision sealing the fate of European Jewry? Was it the product of victory euphoria, of disappointment and frustration over the derailment of Barbarossa, or the calculated reaction to the entry of the U.S. into the war? I argued for September-October 1941 and euphoria victory. What was the proper balance in assessing the relative impacts of center and periphery? Regional studies tended to emphasize the importance of local initiatives, while Peter Longrich, Richard Brightman, and I placed relatively greater emphasis on the center, in particular Hitler and Himmler. Another theme that was not part of the literature examined by Michael, but which has gathered scholarly momentum since the 1980s, is a gendered approach to the Holocaust. Concerning perpetrators, National Socialism represented male dominance, but in their own sphere, women were encouraged to provide the normalizing marriage and home life that enabled men to continue doing terrible things. Moreover, women working in the East provided essential staff for the occupation, helped to implement Nazi racial imperialism, witnessed horrific events, and even participated personally in committing atrocities, as Wendy Lauer has recently shown. Initially, a gendered approach to the victims encountered skepticism and even resistance. Some objected that gender artificially divided the people who had been commonly targeted for total extermination because of its race, and others that a sacred history was being appropriated for a, quote, feminist agenda. In the long run, at least three propositions have generally been accepted. One, that Nazi policies affected Jewish men and women differently at different times. Two, that biological and cultural factors rendered women vulnerable in unique ways. And three, thus, while Jewish men and women faced the same ultimate fate at the hands of the Nazis, their experiences along the path to that common fate differed. The experience of Jewish men was not a universal template for Jewish suffering in the Holocaust, and the experience of women must be recognized and studied in its own right. Debate is still waged over the relative survival aptitudes and skills of men and women, and over the extent of sexual violence against women in the Holocaust. Another area of Holocaust studies that has begun to emerge but has not yet become prominent and did not receive attention in Michael's book concerned the role of economic factors. Helmut Genschel and Abraham Barkay had studied the confiscatory policies of the Nazi regime and the economic struggle of Jews in Germany, respectively. And Gerhard Voss had published a path-breaking exploration of the connection between social and Jewish policy in Vienna. After 1987, the inclusion of economic studies factors in the study of the Holocaust manifested itself in a wide variety of ways. Frank Meir demonstrated how the distribution of Jewish property created wide complicity in Hamburg. Several case studies, such as Peter Hayes' work on I.G. Farben and Degussa, focused on the extent and nature of corporate complicity in Nazi mobilization for war, the plunder of occupied territories, and the exploitation of forced labor and slave labor, a welcome change from the old question about who paid for Hitler. Gertz Ali argued that the massive theft and distribution of Jewish property was crucial to Hitler's dictatorship aiming at pleasing everybody and its ability to maintain Germans' loyalty to the end. Less convincingly, Gertz Ali tried to portray local German administrators in Poland as non-ideological technocrats who advocated the extermination of the Jews as a practical measure to remove a demographic obstacle to the economic modernization of Germany's border in Eastern Europe. Martin Dean confirmed the vast extent of the robbery of Jewish property across an entire continent, and Jan Gross captured the corrupting effect of the lure of Jewish property had on local populations. Christoph Diekmann and Christian Gerlach argued that food shortages precipitated and accelerated the mass murder of Jews at different times and places. Daniel Goldhagen portrayed the Nazi treatment of Jewish labor primarily as a non-utilitarian means of torment, while Wolf Gruner and I argued for a more varied, complex, contested, and often temporarily utilitarian exploitation of Jewish labor as opposed to uniform policies of either destruction through labor or labor as torment. And Adam Tooze demonstrated how inseparable Nazi racial ideology was from the regime's economic planning. Perhaps in no other regard did the opening of East European archives have as much impact as in the proliferation of regional studies of the Nazi occupation regime in Eastern Europe that was spearheaded in particular by a new generation of German historians, such as Christian Gerlach on Belarus, Christoph Diekmann on Lithuania, and Dieter Pohl and Thomas von Kuhler on East Galicia. There were, of course, non-German historians at the forefront of regional research as well. Israel's own Shmuel Spector on Bothnia, Wendy Lauer on Zhytomyr, Eric Steinhardt on Transnistria, Andrew Ezegelis on Latvia, Anton Weisband on Estonia, for example. Various districts of Poland, David Silbertang and Bogdan Muziel on Lublin, Robert Seidel and Jacek Malarczyk on Radom, Sybil Steinbacher on East Upper Silesia, Michael Albertini on Bartikau, were part of this wave of regional studies as well. One effect of these regional studies of German occupation regimes in Eastern Europe was to fill in the many blank spots in our knowledge as to how the murder of the Jews in their areas of densest population concentration had been carried out. The shift of focus eastward and downward has now continued from the regional to the local level, and beyond the German occupier, even more to the local populations with whom Germans and Jews interacted. This approach also emphasized a longer time span to encompass how inter-ethnic relations developed before the arrival of the Germans, and especially how the collapse of multi-ethnic empires in 1918, the defeat, revolution, and civil war, and later the Soviet occupation of the borderland regions between 1939 and 41 explosively impacted the situation. Shimon Redlich's Together and Apart in Brezhny, Omar Bartov's study of Buchach were key local studies for the Ukraine. But the most controversial has been the scholarship on local history in Poland. Jan Gross's Neighbors, focusing on the massacre of the Jewish population of Yadvavna at the hands of its Polish neighbors, whatever the degree of German instigation, provoked furious debates. A veritable flood of new research in the local Holocaust history in Poland followed, of which Jan Gabrowski's Hunt for the Jews and Barbara Engelking's such a beautiful sunny day, focusing on the fateful role of the Poles in uncovering and killing of hidden Jews in rural areas are but two landmark examples. Another set of studies, understandably absent from analysis of Michael's Holocaust in history, are those that constitute the burgeoning field of what I would call aftermath studies. The history of the post-1945 ramifications of the Holocaust is a more recent phenomenon. Two key books, such as Lawrence Langer's The Ruins of Memory and James Young's Textures of Memory, for instance, did not appear until 1991 and 1993, respectively. Much Holocaust literature and cinema were produced earlier, of course, but not yet studied as topics in their own right. The phenomenon of Holocaust museums, memorials, and centers has become widespread, but again, mostly following the opening of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in 1993. One area in which Michael Meir has been himself an active agent in shaping aftermath studies since the publication of the Holocaust in history concerns the examination of post-war Holocaust trials. In addition to his own work on the Nuremberg trials, most importantly, he has supervised 4 graduate students whose revised dissertations have become key books in the field. Rebecca Whitman on the Auschwitz trial, Hilary Earle on the Einsatzgruppen trial, Valerie Hebert on the OKW trial, and Thomas Jardine on the Mauthausen trial. The Holocaust in history marks a particular point of development in Holocaust studies in yet another way, namely that Michael devoted a significant section to the question of uniqueness. It was a term with which he, as an historian, was clearly uncomfortable, because he thought it was more appropriate to political and theological discussion than to historical analysis. He preferred the term unprecedented because it implied a relative rather than absolute finding, namely how much and to what degree did the Holocaust represent a break with the past. Using the Armenian genocide as a starting point and citing Yehuda Bauer, he accepted that the Nazis' all-consuming ideological obsession with Jews, leading them to target all Jews in a program that sought total annihilation, was an unprecedented step. Subsequently, the focus of debate has shifted from the issue of uniqueness to various frameworks of comparison. One such framework has been the examination of Nazi persecution of other victims, such as the Roma and Sinti, the physically and mentally handicapped, Soviet POWs, as well as homosexuals and other so-called asocials. The general conclusion has been that while Nazi racial ideology claimed millions of victims other than Jews, and the same perpetrators killed multiple categories of victims, the priority and totality of the final solution still distinguished it from the other programs of Nazi persecution and mass killing. A second framework concerns the comparison and contrast of the Nazi genocide of the Jews with other genocides. Stephen Katz, I think, stands alone in employing rigorous comparison and contrast in order to arrive at a definition of genocide that not only makes the Holocaust unique, but also the only true genocide in history. Many others have employed comparison to find common features, but not complete identity, between the Holocaust and other 20th century genocides. For example, Robert Nelson emphasized war and revolution, while Eric Weitz focused on race and nation in their comparative works. Yet another approach shifts from the thematic comparison to continuity and focuses on the relationship between European colonialism and the Holocaust. Examining Germany's previous genocide of the Herero and Nama, Jürgen Zimmermann argued that both it and the Holocaust shared common ideological justifications, the racial binary of superior German and inferior natives, and similar means, forced labor, eviction from the land, scorched earth war, massacre, and mass death in camps. But ultimately, Zimmermann did not equate the two. Rather, he found Southwest Africa as a connecting point between genocidal moments on the colonial frontier and what he called the, again the word, unprecedented extent of planned murder in the, quote, largest colonial war in history waged by the Nazi regime. Carol Peter Kakel, focusing on the American Wild West and the German Wild East, found similar patterns of relentless expansion, settler colonialism, assumptions of racial superiority, and genocidal warfare, and thus characterized the Holocaust as a post-colonial genocide. Examining the same two cases, however, Edward Westerman found a fundamental difference between an American, quote, intentional policy of subjugation involving many specific acts of the Lomazy Massacre and a Nazi, quote, intentional policy of annihilation. Adric Moses notes that the Nazis sought to achieve systematically and quickly in the East what unsystematic settler colonization had achieved gradually and incrementally in North America, with the same consequences for Slavs and Native Americans. But he admits that the fate of the Jews and the Nazis was somewhat different. The Jews were treated not only as the colonial other, but were also victims of what he calls a subaltern genocide. He argues in which the Nazis conceived of the Jews as oppressors for whom the Germans proceeded to free themselves in the equivalent of a genocidal war of liberation. But German oppression at the hands of Jews was an imagined fantasy, not an historical reality as experienced by victims of European imperialism and colonization. Ultimately, the Jews of Europe were not murdered because of their land was coveted, or they redeemed a primitive and doomed population standing in the way of progress, but rather because they were considered a unique threat. The colonial paradigm illuminates many Nazi policies in the East, but not their paranoid fantasies about the Jews. The Nazi war against the Jews, as they conceived and propagandized it, went far beyond any colonial analogy. Ultimately, I think we end up with the Nazis' all-consuming ideological obsession with the Jews, aiming at total annihilation as the most unprecedented feature of the Holocaust, just as Michael argued in 1987. If someone attempted to do now what Michael Meir did in 1987, that is to find the present state of Holocaust historiography, the task would be made more difficult by the accumulation of another one-third of a century of scholarship. However, the task would also be made easier by the markers that Michael laid down at that time. Perhaps the most challenging task facing such a hypothetical author would be to equal or surpass judgments Michael made as to how and why Holocaust history should be written. On the one hand, the book is a plea for historians and others to avoid exploiting and politicizing the Holocaust, to avoid discussing meaning and lessons of the Holocaust, because such attempts almost invariably are more about shaping present concerns than understanding past events. This is an admonition Michael has continued to offer even in his most recent book. Michael also advised that history does not rival, negate, or replace commemoration. It is fundamentally important, that is a fundamentally important but different enterprise in its own right. The patient and careful pursuit of historical research, dispassionate questioning and rethinking of accepted generalizations and interpretations does not deny or trivialize the horror and suffering of the Holocaust. Historians may not be able to answer the question as to why there is evil and suffering in the world, but historians can document and analyze how evil and suffering have manifested themselves on a monstrous scale in this particular instance. The writing of history is a human endeavor, and therefore it is not practiced perfectly. It will be marked by contention, error, self-promotion, and bias. But at their best, historians are self-conscious about their potential flaws and honest in their attempt to do the best they can. The alternative to trusting historians of the Holocaust is increasing silence and ultimate oblivion. Michael stated in 1987 that the state of Holocaust historiography provided grounds for optimism. I think it still does today, in large part because of the ongoing efforts of historians like Michael Meir. Michael, for this book and your lifelong contribution to Holocaust scholarship, we are grateful.
Christopher has agreed to comments, questions, as long as they are reasonably short. So, the floor is open.
You mentioned food shortage and some. Can you expand on it?
Yes, several historians, Christoph Diekmann and Christian Gerlach, have noted that in areas where Nazi documents show issues and great concerns about food shortages at particular times, that also correlated. It's hard to prove cause, but what they can demonstrate is that correlates with an acceleration of mass murders of Jews in those areas. So while to say they cannot prove direct causation, they can have evidence of a degree of correlation, and so they're arguing that that should be brought in as one of the mix of factors that we consider in terms of what drove Germans to behave the way they did.
I would like to ask a question. You spoke about historians. How do you explain the fact that philosophers don't deal with the Holocaust? Not really. I mean, there are here and there somebody, but philosophers don't deal with the Holocaust. They don't try to explain it.
Well, first of all, I can't speak for philosophers, so I can't offer that. I mean, some have, Emil Fackenheim and others. I think particularly in the 60s and early 70s, there was a fair degree of activity, both by people in theology and in philosophy. Since then, the center of gravity of the study, I think, has moved to historians and now also to other disciplines as well. Part of my guess is that they didn't go into it because they couldn't figure it out. They didn't have, I mean, to approach it from a philosophical point of view is ultimately to come down to the questions that philosophers have been asking from the beginning of philosophy, and that is this issue: why is there evil in the world? Why is there suffering of this magnitude in the world? And over millennia, philosophers have not answered that. Theologians have offered a variety of answers, but the question keeps getting asked, so clearly it has not satisfied all. So I think the topic probably just was too overwhelming. That would be my guess, but I can't speak with authority.
There's a lady over there, please.
Can you stand up, please? Yes, please.
Speak loud.
Okay, speak loud. Okay. I was very glad that when you got to the 1990s, you said there was a gendered approach beginning then to 1983, which is really important. And but the only work you mentioned was Wendy Lauer's, which was about perpetrators. And since the 1990s, there's been a great many researches and books and conferences about the victims, about women and the Holocaust. So I would just like to add that to what you had to say. Thank you.
Yeah, clearly I wanted to note that has been a post-1987 development. I could not go into details. I tried to mention what the areas or consensus has been like. I mean, I think almost any historian now accepts the validity and the importance of adding gender to our perspective. When that first was brought up in the 1990s, there was some resistance to it initially. So I wanted to both make the point that there was initial resistance, and secondly, now much of that is now accepted, but I obviously could not go into the very broad body of scholarship that we now have. Yeah, please. I'll say one thing, and then we'll turn it over to Michael, and that is clearly for many people responding to the Holocaust from the outside. They were not responding to the Holocaust, they were responding to the refugee crisis earlier. So Jews were perceived as part of the refugee problem to be avoided, not as victims of the genocide to be saved. So we know, for instance, the military often plans to fight wars by the previous, the French Maginot Line being classic, to fight the future war by the past strategy. Politicians process threats and challenges they face by the previous problem, not by the current problem. There, I think you're perfectly right, and that many, particularly in the United States, the whole issue is viewed how does it impact us? It impacts us as a threat to our immigration laws, as a refugee threat, and so it wasn't what's happening to the Jews, it's what's threatening us. And that was seen very much in terms of the refugee problem.
Well, I thank you for the question. I did not expect to intervene this evening, and we'll have perhaps some more to say about these issues tomorrow. Nevertheless, having thanked you for the reference, I do want to indicate, or I do want to suggest a word of caution. The Holocaust is such a massive phenomenon that in the short time that I've been able to deal with the issue, I have heard that the real issue is refugees, or the real issue is race, or the real issue is indifference. And there are more. And there are some real issues that we haven't even thought of as yet. So thanking you for the question, at the same time I want to say that the story of refugees is a vital and important one. I devoted a book to the subject, but at the same time I hesitate mightily to identify a single real issue against which the others have a smaller place. Thank you.
Yes, behind. Yeah.
There is a question that I have not answered for. Maybe you can help. Did the Nazis want the Holocaust or the extermination of Jews be known or keep it secret? I have a point of comparison. For example, Stalin with the purges didn't want the purges to be known, and it took a lot of time to know about it. I have the impression that it was not so the case in the case of the extermination of Jews, but I would like to know if the fear of the regime of overexposing what they were doing was because they feared that the Jews themselves would rebel, or because the other Germans would rebel against this monstrosity, or the Allies. What can we say about the causes for some reluctance, I would say, of the Nazis to say openly what they were doing?
Yes, a very interesting question, and one to which we do not have a simple answer, because the Nazis themselves were not always consistent. That is, on the one hand, you have Hitler repeatedly referring to his January 1939 Reichstag speech, in which he prophesied that if there was another war, it would end in the destruction of the Jewish race in Europe, and boasting about how he was fulfilling that prophecy. So on the one hand, he wanted to have, in a sense, recognition that the prophet had prophesied correctly and he was keeping his word. On the other hand, he also wanted to be the Teflon dictator. He did not want bad feelings to be tied to him, and therefore the Nazis issued a number of orders and policies to keep it secret, to keep people from talking about it. We know that they spent a fair amount of time elaborating cover stories. This was important not only to keep the Jews unsuspecting, but also to lessen any possibilities of unrest or unease within the German population. So in a sense, he wanted it both ways. We know in Goebbels' diaries that he's aware the West knows about it. He even talks about in their secret hearts they're actually agreeing with what we're doing. So on the one hand, of course, they didn't want publicity about this, but on the other hand, they did kind of assume that word had leaked out. So what you get is a very inconsistent picture, and that's why I can't give you a simple answer to that. In one context, when Hitler feels he needs to prove his infallibility, he wants to talk about it. On the other hand, when he's worried about popularity and support for the war and not overtaxing Germans, then he doesn't want to talk about it.
Yes, please.
Thank you. Dan Hoffman wrote it, Don Hoffman wrote it that the Benza only deals with the Jews in Europe. What are your points? What are your views about it? And what was the plans of the Nazis for the Europe and the rest of the world, in North Africa and Middle East, as they focus here?
Okay, in terms of the Middle East, we know two things. One, Einsatzgruppen was planned to be sent to Rommel's North African Corps when they approached the Suez Canal before it finally halted at the first battle of the British halt, and then later at Al Alamein, of course, they were driven back. So there were plans to send a Einsatzgruppen in the notion that they were going to cross the Suez and come to Palestine. We do know that Hitler in November 41, in discussions with the Mufti, said he had no interest in the Middle East other than coming there to kill Jews, and then he would leave it to the locals. Now, whether Germans would really have kept their word to the Mufti, Hitler never did anybody else in terms of you can have your land, he fooled everybody, posing as a national liberator and then not doing that. But it does seem that Palestine was targeted. On the other hand, there wasn't any huge emergency or any priority given, for instance, to take Jews from North Africa across the Mediterranean like they did from Rhodes. Jews were collected on the islands of the Aegean from Greek Jews, but Jews in Libya, Tunisia, when the Germans were there, are not rounded up, and some are rounded up and put in camp, but they are not deported or they are not killed in the systematic program. My feeling is that ultimately, for Hitler, he was going to kill Jews wherever the Germans controlled territories and had the capacity to do it, and that ultimately what put boundaries on the Holocaust were the extensive German military conquest. But there wasn't open planning beyond, as I say, I think in 42 to equip Rommel's army with a killing squad that would have to come into Palestine. Yeah.
Aside from further case studies, considering how exhaustive all the aspects of the studies, what remains for future researchers?
I always hesitate to say where things are going from here, because I remember that when I first approached my doctoral dissertation supervisor and was shifting out of a MA that I did on French diplomatic history into what we then called Nazi persecution of the Jews. I didn't even use the Holocaust. I explained what I wanted to do. His answer was, well, that's a very good dissertation topic, but it has no professional future. So historians are not very good at predicting. So where things are going from here, certainly I think there's still developments of aftermath studies, because of course that does continue. I think there will be more work in local areas of Eastern Europe, because the ethnic combinations are almost infinite from one area to another. And we know certain examples of the Ukraine in Poland. We know some in Transylvania and elsewhere. But in a sense, there's still plenty of room to look at the way in which different ethnic combinations and different timetables of Soviet presence or not, between 33 and 39, 41, and so forth, impacted this collapse in relations between Jews and their neighbors that created such a combustible situation. And when the Germans come in 41, it just lights a match and it explodes. So I think there's still work to be done in terms of looking at as a large number of variations of that in different local towns and areas of Europe. Those two, I think, are still there. I'm not sure how much further we have to go in exploring this colonial imperialism comparison. Some people are still very interested in that. I'm not sure whether there's a large future in it, but that seems to be an area right now where people are looking in terms of comparative stuff.
Could I just add a word of, again, I feel it is almost my professional obligation to be sounding notes of caution, but you mentioned the exhaustive research done on the Holocaust. I would perhaps refer to it rather as exhausting. People have been writing about the fall of the Roman Empire for a long, long time. And one might think, well, don't we know enough about the fall of the Roman Empire? We actually do not. I mean, at least I have a wonderful group of colleagues who work on classical history. I realize this is a field that has perhaps lost some of its allure, but I think it will come back. And when it comes back, people will constantly be asking questions that we never thought about for the fall of the Roman Empire. Never thought about it. My goodness. Well, I believe that is the case with the history of the Holocaust. It is an extraordinary topic, and I'll have a bit more to say about it. You heard that?
Well, first of all, we thank Chris for a wonderful lecture here. I want to add something to what Michael just said. I'm no admirer of monocausal explanations, but we do have one of the topics that you mentioned is, of course, in all our work, and that is the relative importance, yes or no, of the anti-Semitic ideology motivating local situations. We now have, for instance, a tremendous 2-volume study in Polish, which is going to be translated into English, called the Polish Dalej jest noc, which means night still continues, which deals with 9 areas in Poland and micro-history. The greatest of details. And there, this question of anti-Semitism, of course, comes up. Now, you are, of course, fully aware of the document of August 1936 that Hitler memorandum to Goering, number 1 to number 2, which was not propaganda, but it was a private communication, in which he argued that Bolshevism is a great enemy for which Germany has to prepare for war against, and that Bolshevism intends to enthrone the Jewish international conspiracy over the world. So clearly an anti-Semitic motive. And then, of course, you mentioned the very famous speech in January 1939 by Hitler. And I wonder how you would today continue to explore the importance of this. On the one hand, in the local area, you very clearly stated what you think in Ordinary Men, also in Starkowitz and in other places. That's on the local sphere. On the overall issue, there is this document, and that document has been on since 1945. This is nothing new. Nobody has referred to it. I don't know anyone, any serious historian who has dealt with this particular document, which is, to my mind, a key document. Whether you think that this is an eye-opener or whatever, but it's clearly something that one has to consider.
Yeah, I think in a sense we have three separate historical problems combined into one by different aspects of anti-Semitism. One is Hitler, and I think virtually all historians agree that this is a central obsession to Hitler. We differ as to when that obsession turns into a concrete plan, as opposed to a set of priorities that are open-ended as to how they will be solved. Certainly by 36, he's going to go to war. By 33, even the generals, when he talks in his February 33 talks, it's very clear rearmament is going to be priority in going to war. And even before that, his whole notions of Lebensraum implies war. So war and anti-Semitism, I think, are there from the beginning. I think Eberhard Jeckel's book that in the 60s talks about how it's crystallized into a package Weltanschauung is still a remarkably good book. But that does leave open when did this take on sort of concrete form. And I remember at a conference we had a couple of years ago, Tom Weber, who's done work on this, is becoming increasingly what he says kind of a belated intentionalist. But the quote he came up from the 1920s was Hitler basically saying he wanted to kill the Jews, but it wasn't practical. The issue is, when did he consider it practical? When did this become something you could do, as opposed to something that you could fantasize about? And that's what I think the debate about 1941 is all about, is when Hitler is convinced that he could get away with it, he could actually do it. And that he still is the key decision maker, but it's still, obsession is not turned into policy until 1941. So the issue then of the actual face-to-face killers, ordinary men, I don't even talk about this, but down to the grassroots level, the environment in which the Jews are living, which makes it in Eastern Europe, facilitates and makes possible this as well. And certainly there, I think, with so much of the research we're getting now, is just how isolated, just how vulnerable Jews had become in the local areas in which they were living in Eastern Europe because of this whole succession of events of the collapse of multi-ethnic empires, the Bolshevik Revolution, and finally, of course, particularly the borderlands that are occupied by Stalin in 1939. So I think all of those are major components, and they all are aspects of anti-Semitism, but anti-Semitism manifesting itself in very different ways.
I think you misunderstood my question. I did not argue that this particular document and similar things like it are a plan for killing Jews. I think it was a part of a motivation to start a war, which is something different. In other words, I will argue that the question that these documents face us with is whether the anti-Semitic motivation was part of the planning of a war.
For Hitler, war is always in the context of a racial struggle. All of history is a struggle between races. So he is fighting all the other races that also want Lebensraum. But in that war, what threatens Germany's capacity to win the war is the unique threat that Jews represent of weakening the German race by race mixing. Pure race strong, mixed race weak is one axiom. And the other is Jews are the carriers of the ideas that undermine the capacity of Germans to wage a no-hold-barred, unfettered struggle. Christianity, turn the other cheek, liberalism, equality, communism, brotherhood of workers. These are the three great Jewish conspiracies that are undermining Germany's capacity to wage that war as the war of destruction that Hitler finally gets in 1941.
Chris, you used the word which I found very strange, practical. What does he mean by practical?
Do it.
Could he do it, or did he see that there was a value in it?
Well, I think he sees a value in it because, as I say, the Jews are the the threat to Germany's capacity to wage and win a racial war for race. Can he, in fact, solve that threat? First, one way to solve it is you expel Jews and let somebody else have them in their country, but not in Germany. The ultimate, as we see, of course, that is more, it turns out it's more difficult to expel Jews than kill them. And ultimately then, the combination of the war in the East and the fact that these other alternatives have turned out to be much more complicated, it becomes practical, in fact, to kill them, because you get, people will do it. People will not only do it, but people will work towards the Fuhrer to do it for him. Which they wouldn't have done, earlier.
All right, as a matter of practicality, I think that we owe Christopher a great deal of gratitude for a marvelous talk, and we invite you to come tomorrow for a full day of intellectual nourishment. And once again, a great thank you to the organizers and to Michael and